Usually when you look at how ancient texts are used in the modern world, especially texts that have been recited for centuries, there's this overwhelming expectation of like ritualistic comfort.
Right, like an anesthetic almost.
Exactly, an anesthetic. And picture the scene, right? A person is lying on their deathbed, the breathing gets incredibly shallow, the heart monitor is slowing down, and the family gathers around in this hushed, somber room, and they begin to whisper these very specific verses, Surah Yaseen, over the person to just, ease the passing.
Right, to make the transition out of this life smoother. It's entirely treated as a sedative.
Yeah.
Like spiritual palliative care, basically. And from a psychological standpoint, you can completely understand why society develops that reflex.
For sure.
I mean, we inherently crave things that give us a sense of closure, right? Something that smooths over the terrifying rough edges of human mortality.
I want a lullaby for the end of the line.
Exactly, a lullaby.
But then I was reading through this analytical lecture by Allama Parvez where he completely deconstructs the actual linguistic and socio-economic reality of what those specific verses are saying.
Yeah, and it's a wild shift.
It really is. Suddenly, that palliative sedative is just violently stripped away. You realize that we're looking at a text that is, honestly, the exact opposite of a lullaby.
Yeah.
It's a blaring, deafening alarm clock.
It is the absolute definition of a cognitive shock to the system.
Right.
And Parvez's entire premise rests on exposing what he calls a tragic civilizational irony. Because what's deeply unsettling here is how completely, how methodically a society can invert the original stated purpose of a message over time.
Right, because his central argument is just wild when you first hear it.
It really throws you.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look at the first 10 verses of Surah Yaseen exactly through Parvez's framework. And he argues that this text, which for generations has been universally whispered to the dying to help their souls depart, was actually engineered as an urgent, highly rational socio-economic blueprint. Yeah. It was explicitly designed to awaken the living.
Right, which means treating it like a deathbed ritual is a fundamental misdiagnosis of the text's intent.
A total 180.
Exactly. Parvez actually points out the supreme irony of this. He notes that later in this very same chapter, the text explicitly states its own purpose.
Right.
It says it's there to deliver a message of life, to be a warning for whoever is alive. And yet, humanity took the ultimate manual for building a thriving, rational, structurally sound society and repurposed it into a passive death ritual.
It's kind of tragic when you put it like that.
It is. I mean, if you want a metaphor for a stagnant civilization, that is it right there. Taking the architecture of life and burying it with the dead.
Wow. Yeah, okay.
So our goal today is to meticulously strip away centuries of that ritualistic baggage.
Yeah.
We are not looking at this as theology. We are not looking at it as mysticism or magic. We're analyzing it as a stark framework for rational governance and really a highly critical tool for societal diagnosis.
I love that framing. And Parvez doesn't waste any time, right? He goes straight for the title itself.
Right.
Right out of the gate, he tackles the phrase Yasin.
Yes.
Because for the longest time, these opening letters of certain Quranic chapters, the Muqatta'at, or disconnected letters, they've been treated as this impenetrable mystical code.
Right. The secret cipher?
Exactly. People look at them and think, oh, it's a secret language between the divine and the messenger. It's pure magic, totally beyond human comprehension.
Right.
But Parvez doesn't buy into that mystical aura at all, does he? He grounds it instantly in pure linguistics and history.
He demystifies it completely, and he does it by looking at the literary environment of ancient Arabia.
Okay.
He explains that these disconnected letters were essentially an ancient Semitic form of abbreviations.
Abbreviation.
Exactly. This was a highly common literary style, not just in Arabic, but in Hebrew, Syriac, and other dominant regional languages of that era.
So it's like how we use acronyms today.
Yes,
Yeah.
perfectly analogous.
If I send you a text that says ASAP, or you get a wedding invite that says RSVP, you don't stare at the card thinking I've sent you a mystical incantation.
Right. You're not casting a spell.
You don't think RSVP is a magical chant that will summon the caterer? You know perfectly well it stands for a specific, universally understood phrase within our cultural context.
Precisely. And because this abbreviational style was a common vernacular among the ancient Arabs, the original audience who first heard Yasin understood exactly what those letters referenced.
It wasn't a mystery to them.
Not at all. They didn't even ask the messenger for an explanation because it was the literary water they were swimming in.
Interesting.
Parwez argues that it is only much later generations, people who were completely disconnected from that specific ancient literary style, who looked back, didn't understand the abbreviations, and just started projecting all these heavy mystical meanings onto them.
To cover up the linguistic gap.
Exactly, to cover up the fact that they just didn't know what it meant anymore.
Okay, so let's actually break down what Yasin means in that original context, because this is the architectural metaphor that Parwez brings up, and it completely shifts how you view leadership.
It really does.
The Ya is straightforward. It's an address. It means "oh" or "hey you," directed at someone specific.
Yeah.
But the sin, that is where it gets incredibly concrete.
Right.
Tell me if I have this right. In ancient Arab architecture, sin refers to a very specific piece of wood, right?
Yes, it does. And the context of their physical environment is crucial to understanding why this metaphor carries so much weight.
Okay.
So in the Hijaz region, high-quality timber was relatively scarce. When they constructed the roofs of their dwellings, they used minor wooden beams, which they called shatir.
Shatir, right.
Now, think about a mud and timber roof in a harsh desert environment. Over time, due to the intense heat or, under the incredibly heavy load of a rare but torrential desert rainstorm, those mighty wooden beams would begin to weaken.
That start to give way.
Exactly. They would sag and bow. The entire roof would be in imminent danger of a catastrophic collapse. And a collapse meant the structure crushes the family living underneath it.
Right. So it's not just a cosmetic issue.
Yeah.
It's a life or death structural failure.
Exactly. So to prevent this collapse, the builders would wedge a massive, incredibly strong central wooden pillar directly underneath those failing beams.
Just to hold the entire roof up.
Yes. In their language, that central load-bearing pillar, the one taking on the weight of the failing structure, was called a sin.
The imagery there is just so vivid. It's a structural support for a failing roof.
Right.
But they didn't just confine this word to architecture. They took this engineering term and applied it socially to human beings.
They did. Over time, the Arabs started calling the leader of their tribe the Sin.
Wow.
But, and this is key, this wasn't a generic title for anyone with money or power.
Right.
They didn't call a man a Sin because he had hoarded the most wealth, or because he was a tyrant who exploited people, or because he had a fancy bloodline.
So what was the criteria?
A leader was strictly defined as a Sin if his primary day-to-day function was to be the structural support for the weak, the marginalized, and the vulnerable in that society.
So basically, if you weren't actively propping up the people who were collapsing under the weight of societal oppression, you simply weren't a sin.
Exactly.
You were just a guy.
Yeah.
Parwez even notes that in their cultural language, they didn't really consider someone a fully realized human being unless they served this supportive, load-bearing function for others.
That is the core of it. True leadership in this linguistic framework is defined entirely by socio-economic utility.
Right.
It's defined by who you are carrying.
Man. So let's put that back into the text. When the chapter opens with Yasin, it is not chanting magic syllables into the ether. It's issuing a very specific address.
Yes.
It is saying, "O you who has stepped up to be the structural support for the weak and vulnerable of humanity." It is defining the messenger not by some glowing mystical aura, not by how many miracles he can perform, but by his absolute socio-economic utility.
Whoa.
The text is literally calling him the load-bearing beam of a new, equitable society.
Which is a profoundly heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
And that leads directly into the second verse, which establishes the authority and the blueprint for this massive structural mission.
Okay, what does it say?
The text immediately swears an oath on the Quran-il-Hakeem. Now, traditionally, that gets translated simply as the wise book. But again, Parwez shifts our entire paradigm here by looking at the roots.
Right, because Hakeem doesn't just mean like a wise old man sitting on a mountain giving out riddles.
No, not at all. Hakeem shares an etymological root with the concept of governance, with issuing rational directives, with establishing a binding system of law and order.
Wow, okay.
Parwez argues that the oath is being sworn on a governing constitution.
A constitution.
Yes. This isn't a book of spells to ward off bad luck, and it's not just a collection of nice moral suggestions. It is a comprehensive, structured system of rational laws and principles designed to govern a society.
This is where I struggle a bit with how we usually interpret these things.
How so?
Well, I always thought the straight path, the Sirati Mustaqim that the text says this leader is on,
Yeah.
just meant being a good, pious person.
Right.
You know, keep your head down, don't steal, pray your prayers, be generally nice, and boom, you're on the straight path. But Parwez is saying that's not enough, right?
Right.
You can be perfectly pious in your own little bubble, but completely useless to the broader society.
That is the crucial distinction Parwez makes. He forcefully argues against the idea of the straight path as mere personal, isolated piety.
Okay.
Think about the geometry of a straight line. It has a definite starting point, and it moves directly, without deviation, toward a specific destination. If the straight path was just about individual moral purity, it wouldn't need a comprehensive book of governance. Parwez views the straight path as purposeful, systemic alignment.
Systemic alignment. Okay,
Mhm.
let's play with that. What separates a truly purposeful path from someone who's just walking in circles but sweating a lot?
That's a great question.
Because I feel like modern society is full of people doing a lot of things but getting nowhere.
The difference is that motion does not equal progress.
Ooh, I like that.
You can be on a treadmill in a gym, running at top speed, sweating profusely, completely exhausted by the effort, but you haven't moved an inch forward in the physical world.
Right.
You've generated a lot of heat, but no actual momentum. A purposeful path means that your individual actions, your daily choices, are explicitly aligned with a broader systemic design.
That's actually moving the needle.
Yes, moving the needle toward a specific, constructive goal in the real world. In the context of Parwez's analysis, the destination of this path is the establishment of a rational society where human potential can actually flourish and where the weak are supported.
Let me throw a corporate analogy at you to see if this tracks.
Go for it.
Think about a massive, complex project at a tech company. You can have an employee who is incredibly busy. They are answering hundreds of emails a day, shuffling papers, attending back-to-back meetings.
Right, always the first in the office and the last to leave.
Exactly. They look like they are working incredibly hard.
Yeah.
That is mere motion. That's the treadmill.
Yes.
But if their daily work doesn't actually align with the strategic goal of the company, they're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. They were essentially walking in circles.
Perfectly said.
So the straight path is when your granular daily tasks are perfectly, meticulously mapped to the overarching mission. That alignment is what creates actual forward momentum. So when the text says the messenger is on a straight path, it means every single one of his actions is perfectly calibrated to the rational governance outlined in that wise book.
That is a perfect parallel. It's the transition from mechanical busyness to strategic execution.
Yeah.
And this alignment is what allows a society to transition from merely surviving to actually living a purposeful existence. But this brings us to a massively important question in Parwez's analysis.
Which is?
Who is this highly structured, rational system actually for? Because if this is a blueprint for a functioning society, we have to look at the target audience.
Yes, and this is where the text pivots from the design of the path to the specific type of person expected to walk it.
Exactly.
The source hones in on the Arabic word inzar, which gets translated as warning or to make aware of an impending danger. And the text says this warning is only for a specific type of person.
This is where Parwez's logic is just razor sharp in its pragmatism. He asks a fundamentally simple question. Who do you warn? If you're walking down a mountain path and you see that a bridge is out ahead, or there is a massive rock slide, or, I don't know, a venomous snake on the road, who do you shout a warning to?
Right.
You only warn someone who is alive, who has the capacity to hear you, process the information, and change their trajectory. You do not shout a warning at a corpse.
You cannot warn a dead body about a cliff.
Exactly.
It sounds so incredibly obvious when you say it out loud, but the implications of that for how we read ancient texts are staggering.
They really are.
Parwez argues that the entire text is exclusively addressed to the living. But he makes very clear he doesn't mean biologically living, right? He's not just talking about people with a pulse.
Yeah, no, he is talking about a state of cognitive life. He means individuals who still possess a cognitive spark.
Right.
The text specifies it as a warning for those who follow the reminder and who have a deep sense of accountability, a fear of the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are unseen in the immediate present.
So it's for people who can conceptualize the future. I have to admit, I struggle a bit with this concept.
How so?
Well, isn't it incredibly arrogant from a sociological standpoint, to look at a whole segment of the population and classify their minds as dead.
Ah.
Like, who gets to decide whose mind is dead and whose is alive? It feels almost elitist, like saying this system is only for the intellectual upper crust.
It's a very fair pushback, and honestly, it's a danger in any rationalist framework. But Parwez isn't saying this is a genetic trait,
Okay.
or that some people are inherently biologically incapable of thought. He frames it as an acquired state of being.
Acquired. Got it.
He uses an agricultural metaphor straight from the text to explain this, and it really grounds the concept. The Quran frequently talks about giving life to Ard al-Maita, the dead earth.
The dead earth, right.
Parwez explains that if you have a patch of completely dead, barren earth dirt that has been overfarmed, scorched by the sun, where all the basic nutrients, the minerals, the microscopic chemical vitality has been completely stripped away, you can bring the most advanced agricultural technology to it. You can bring massive tractors, the best harvesters, and pump endless gallons of water over it, and it will do absolutely nothing.
Right. You can plant the most expensive, genetically perfected seeds in the world, and they will just sit in the dirt and rot.
Precisely. Because the soil itself lacks the foundational structural elements to support life.
Okay. I see where this is going.
Parwez argues that from a socio-economic standpoint, you cannot just drop a high-level, sophisticated system of rational governance onto a population that has been intellectually starved.
Yeah.
A population that has surrendered its critical thinking to dogma or tyranny. The soil of their minds is dead.
So what do you do?
First, you have to cultivate that soil. You have to patiently introduce those basic intellectual and moral minerals back into the people.
Right.
You have to teach them how to think independently, how to question authority, how to value objective truth over tribal loyalty. Only once that cognitive baseline is established can the seed of this wise book actually take root and grow into a functioning society.
Okay, let me bring this out of the ancient agricultural world and into the 21st century.
Please do.
It's like trying to execute a massive, sophisticated software update. Imagine you have this incredible, revolutionary new operating system.
Right.
The code is flawless. It's designed to optimize everything, patch all the security vulnerabilities, and make the whole network run at peak efficiency.
Sounds great.
That operating system is the wise book. But it doesn't matter how brilliant that code is if the hardware you're trying to install it on is literally powered off.
Exactly.
Or worse, what if the hardware actively refuses the connection because it's running on a heavily corrupted legacy system that automatically firewalls any new data?
That is a phenomenal parallel. It perfectly captures the friction. And it forces us to confront a really uncomfortable reality about systems that are built entirely on reason and free will.
Yeah.
How does a purely rational system handle the messy human fact that not everyone actually wants to use their reason?
Right. Because you can't force a software update on a machine that's unplugged from the wall.
You really can't.
And if the system is truly rational, it can't use coercion.
Yeah.
It can't use a sword to make someone think critically.
Exactly. A system based on critical thought, evidence, and rational governance cannot, by its very definition, force the unwilling to participate. Coercion destroys reason.
Right.
The system only engages those who are already inclined to think, those who are willing to take brutal responsibility for their own trajectory. And Parwez points out a fascinating historical proof of this.
What's the proof?
During the first 13 years of the messenger's mission in Mecca, before the migration to Medina, he wasn't building a state. He wasn't passing mechanical laws about economics or criminal justice.
Like his early days?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why? Because he was entirely focused on human development. He was out in the barren field tilling the soil. He was actively searching for those specific individuals who still had that spark of life, the desire to emerge from the darkness of tribal ignorance into the light of reason, and he was cultivating them.
He was upgrading the hardware, person by person, before he ever tried to install the societal operating system.
Precisely.
And the source material highlights this beautifully by looking at the dichotomy between two incredibly famous historical figures from that era, Abu Jahl and Umar.
Yes, the perfect case study.
Before they encountered this new system of thought, both of them were totally immersed in the exact same tribal, aggressive, intellectually stagnant culture of Mecca.
Right.
The source refers to that period as the era of ignorance or darkness. And historically, the messenger actually hoped to recruit one of them to strengthen the cause, viewing both men as possessing raw, undeniable leadership potential and influence.
They both had the raw capacity to be a sin, a
Yeah.
structural pillar.
Right.
But the outcome of their encounter with the warning was entirely dependent on their internal cognitive state.
Yeah.
Umar chose to engage his reason. It wasn't easy, but he allowed the new data to aggressively challenge his pre-existing tribal beliefs.
He accepted the software update.
Yes. He accepted the software update, to use your term, and he fundamentally altered his trajectory, eventually becoming one of the foundational load-bearing pillars of the new civilization.
And what about Abu Jahl?
Well, Abu Jahl, presented with the exact same data, the exact same rational arguments, stubbornly refused to process it.
He firewalled the information.
Exactly. He chose the comfort of his legacy system. He chose to remain in the dark.
Which brings up a really chilling question for you, the listener. If a rational system only works for the willing, and it cannot force compliance, what is the exact mechanism that causes someone like Abu Jahl to become completely, irredeemably unreachable?
It's a dark thought.
How does the human mind evolve into a completely closed loop? Because Parvez argues this isn't just a matter of someone being stubborn for a day. There's a structural breakdown happening.
Yes. And this brings us into the most psychologically intense part of Parvez's analysis, the law of atrophy and the concept of what the text calls sealed hearts.
Okay, the sealed hearts.
The verses use incredibly stark, almost claustrophobic imagery here. It describes a group of people who have a massive barrier placed directly in front of them, another impenetrable barrier placed directly behind them, and their sight completely covered over.
Now, I have to stop you there, because when I read that we have placed a barrier before them and a barrier behind them, that sounds exactly like a divine punishment.
I know, it really does on the surface.
It sounds like Parvez is doing some serious linguistic gymnastics to avoid the obvious reading. I mean, doesn't the text literally say that God locked them in a dark box? If God puts a wall in front of you, you aren't responsible for not being able to see.
It's a vital pushback, and it gets to the absolute core of Parvez's entire hermeneutic framework. How does he define God doing something in the text?
Right.
In Parvez's socio-economic rational reading, when the text says God placed a barrier or God sealed their hearts, it is almost never referring to an arbitrary magical intervention from the sky.
So what is it referring to?
It's referring to the natural, immutable laws of cause and effect that have been established in the universe.
Okay.
If I choose to step off the ledge of a 10-story building, gravity will pull me down to the pavement. I don't say, God arbitrarily decided to pull me down and break my legs today.
Right, obviously.
I say, I invoked the natural law of gravity by my own action, and I suffered the inevitable consequence.
Ah, okay. So the seal is a consequence of a natural law, not an arbitrary punishment.
Exactly, and Parvez calls this the psychological and sociological law of atrophy. It is the exact same principle we see in biology.
Like with muscles.
Exactly. If you break your arm, put it in a hard plaster cast, and absolutely do not use those muscles for 6 months, what happens?
The muscles atrophy. You take the cast off, and your arm is weak, withered, and practically useless. Use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it is the perfect summary of the law atrophy. Parvez argues this exact biological law applies with terrifying precision to human cognitive faculties. Critical thinking, moral reasoning, the courage to question the status quo, the ability to process new and uncomfortable data, these are all muscles of the mind.
Right.
If a society or an individual consistently refuses to exercise those faculties, if they constantly defer to dogma, if they let others do their thinking for them, those faculties simply wither away, they atrophy.
So a sealed heart is not a door that a higher power walked up to and locked from the outside to punish you.
No.
A sealed heart is a mind that has systematically locked itself from the inside, bolt by bolt, through repeated daily refusal to engage in critical thought.
Yes. The seal is self-inflicted. And Parvez offers this striking, deeply uncomfortable physical metaphor to explain the reality of this state.
What's the metaphor?
He compares the condition of blind adherence to past traditions, a concept called taqlid in the source, to a person who has strapped a stiff, rigid cervical collar or a metal neck brace around their own throat.
Oh, man. Okay, let's really unpack this neck brace metaphor, because when I read it, it made my skin crawl a bit.
It's very visceral.
If you've ever had to wear one of those rigid medical collars, or even just seen someone wearing one, you know it completely immobilizes the head.
Right.
You cannot look down at your own feet. You cannot turn your head to the left or the right to check your blind spots. You are locked in a rigid forward-facing stare.
Exactly. Now, map that physical limitation onto the psyche of an entire civilization.
That is claustrophobic.
It is. Parwez is saying that when a society adopts taqlid, when they decide that all the great thinking was done by their ancestors centuries ago and all they have to do is blindly copy it, they are strapping on a cognitive neck brace.
Wow.
Because they cannot physically look down, they become totally disconnected from the ground they are currently standing on. They lose touch with the modern, present-day reality of their own socioeconomic decay.
And what about the walls? The text says there is a barrier behind them. How does Parwez explain that sociologically?
The barrier behind them means they are rendered intellectually incapable of looking back at history with any kind of critical analytical eye. They cannot learn the harsh lessons of why previous civilizations or even their own ancestors collapsed. Now, they might glorify the past.
Right, nostalgically.
Exactly. Parwez often critiques societies that constantly sing songs about their mythical golden age, talking endlessly about the grandeur of past empires or the piety of ancient scholars, while ignoring the fact that their current streets are crumbling and their institutions are corrupt.
Yeah.
The barrier behind them means history has been flattened into a mythology they hide behind, rather than data they use to correct their course.
They worship the ashes instead of preserving the fire.
Well put.
And the barrier in front of them.
That wall is their total blindness to the future. Because their critical faculties have atrophied, and because they cannot process new data, they cannot extrapolate the future consequences of their current actions.
They can't see where they're going.
Right. They are walking steadily toward a civilizational cliff, but because of the neck brace keeping them rigid and the wall in front blocking their foresight, they cannot see the drop-off until they are already falling.
And finally, the verse concludes that their eyes are covered.
This is the ultimate tragedy of unexamined dogma. Their vision, their very capacity for insight, is shrouded.
Right.
Parwez makes a beautiful linguistic note here. It's not just their physical sight, their bazaar, that is lost, but their basarat.
Basarat.
Their inner vision, their penetrating critical faculties. They can physically see the world around them, but they cannot comprehend the reality of it.
I want to pause here because this made me look really closely at my own life.
How so?
It is so easy to point at ancient societies or religious fundamentalists and say, look at them in their cognitive neck braces. But I was thinking about my own media diet and the algorithms that feed us information every single second of the day.
Oh, absolutely.
We are currently living in a digital ecosystem that is quite literally engineered to confirm our existing biases.
Yeah.
If I click on an article that leans a certain political way, the algorithm feeds me 10 more just like it.
It actively shields you from the friction of opposing viewpoints.
Exactly. If Parwez is right, that a faculty consistently refused simply withers away, how often are we in the modern world actively participating in the atrophy of our own critical thinking?
That is the big question.
Are we, without even realizing it, strapping on custom-fitted algorithmic neck braces? Are we building massive digital walls behind us and in front of us just so we don't have to deal with the exhausting friction of changing our minds?
That is the exact terrifying modern application of this ancient diagnostic tool. The mechanism of atrophy hasn't changed. We've just automated it.
Yeah.
And Parwez warns that when a society reaches a critical mass of individuals who have atrophied in this way, they hit a terrifying civilizational tipping point.
Which moves us to the fourth major concept Parwez unpacks, the point of absolute futility.
Yes.
Having diagnosed the anatomy of a sealed mind, the text moves to the civilizational consequence. And the verses do not pull their punches here.
Not at all.
The text insists, flat out, that for these specific individuals, the ones in the neck braces, it makes absolutely no difference whether you warn them or not. They will not believe. They will not alter their course. The warning is utterly futile.
It is a chilling realization for any reformer or leader, but again, we must read this sociologically, keeping the law of atrophy in mind.
Right.
It's not that a deity has arbitrarily decided to abandon them and block their ears. It's that they have systematically dismantled their own internal institutions of reason.
They did it to themselves.
Exactly. They have actively rendered their own cognitive hardware incapable of processing the software update. You can scream the warning at the top of your lungs, but the receiver is broken.
The warning just bounces harmlessly off the walls they've built around themselves.
Exactly. And Parwez points out a fascinating historical symptom of a civilization that has crossed this point of no return.
What's the symptom?
When a society's critical thinking is dead, but they still want to feel like they are doing something to fix their decline, they start seeking incredibly superficial, mechanical solutions to fundamental systemic decay.
They mistake mechanical repetition for meaningful living.
Precisely.
Oh, this brings up my absolute favorite anecdote from the source material. I was reading the section where Parwez talks about the Chakralwa sect, the Ali Quran, and I honestly couldn't believe their proposed solution to civilizational collapse.
It's a classic example.
Can we dive into this? Because it perfectly illustrates the utter absurdity of treating a deep systemic disease with a cosmetic band-aid.
We have to, because it's the perfect case study. Parwez shares this historical anecdote about the Ali Quran sect functioning during a time when the broader Muslim world was in a state of steep, undeniable decline.
Okay.
We are talking about severe poverty, massive political weakness, colonialism taking hold, and deep intellectual stagnation. The leaders of this sect looked around and correctly identified that there was a massive problem.
The roof is absolutely caving in.
Right. But because their own critical faculties regarding the purpose of religion had atrophied, their diagnosis of the root cause and their grand proposed solution was entirely laughably mechanical.
Right. They looked at the massive, complex machinery of a failing civilization and thought, oh, I know exactly what the problem is. We're spending way too much time hitting the prayer button on the machine.
Precisely. They reasoned that the primary cause of their societal and economic failure was that Muslims were spending far too much time during the day performing the 5 mandatory prayers.
Wow.
They thought it was an efficiency issue. So their grand revolutionary solution to reverse centuries of civilizational collapse was to mechanically reduce the mandatory daily prayers from 5 times a day to 3 times a day.
I mean, it is almost comical when you lay it out like that.
It really is.
It's like looking at a massive, failing tech conglomerate today. Imagine a company where the core product is totally obsolete. The corporate culture is incredibly toxic, executives are embezzling money, and the stock price is plummeting towards zero.
Yeah.
And the CEO steps up to the podium at an all-hands meeting and says, "Everyone, I have found the solution to our crisis. Starting tomorrow, we are going to change our weekly sync meetings from Tuesdays to Thursdays. That's going to fix the revenue."
It is a profound category error. It completely misses the fundamental why of the institution in the first place.
Yeah.
Parwez argues that tweaking the physical mechanics of a ritual does absolutely nothing if the core character, the critical thought, and the ethical transactions of the human beings performing that ritual remain dead.
Exactly.
The entire purpose of the ritual, the prayer in this case, is supposed to be a calibration of the moral compass. It is supposed to cultivate a character that manifests in the real world.
How honestly you treat your neighbor, how fairly you conduct your business.
Yes. And how fiercely you uphold justice in your society. If the compass is utterly broken, recalibrating how often you look at it won't help you find north.
He actually quotes a famous historical interaction to drive this point home, involving the second caliph, Umar.
Oh, that's a brilliant story.
A man came to Umar to vouch for another person's character in a legal matter, saying, "I know this man. He is a great, highly pious individual."
Right.
And Umar, who was famously pragmatic, asked him 3 rapid-fire questions. Have you ever been his neighbor and dealt with him day to day? Have you ever traveled with him and seen how he handles stress? Have you ever done financial business with him?
The real tests of character.
Exactly. And the man replied, "No, none of those things. I've just seen him praying constantly in the mosque." And Umar basically looked at him and said, "Then you do not know this man at all."
That is the absolute crux of Parwez's socio-economic argument. A system, no matter how divinely inspired or rationally perfect its constitution is only as good as the human beings operating it.
Yeah.
If you have a society of individuals whose critical faculties have completely atrophied, who are proudly wearing the cognitive neck brace of blind tradition, no amount of mechanical restructuring will save them.
You can rewrite the Constitution 100 times.
Exactly. You can change the voting age, you can tweak the tax codes, you can alter the legal frameworks. Parwez lists all these mechanical state-building exercises. But if the humans running the system are ethically and intellectually dead earth, the system will inevitably fail.
Wow. Form without function is just a corpse dressed in fine clothes.
Beautifully put.
It is genuinely terrifying when you apply this diagnostic to any modern society.
Yeah.
What does that tipping point look like from the inside? How do you know when your civilization has crossed it?
Right.
It looks exactly like that Ali Quran anecdote. It looks like a civilization aggressively mistaking the blind repetition of old habits for actual purposeful living.
Yes.
It looks like a society that violently rejects any new light, any new data, simply because the darkness has become comfortable and familiar.
The source material actually uses a very evocative biological metaphor for this exact state of comfortable darkness.
What is it?
The bat, the chambudar.
Oh, right.
Parwez notes that there are some people who are born in the dark or find themselves in the dark, and the moment you tell them about the light, the moment you issue the warning, they intuitively want to move toward it.
They recognize their condition.
Exactly. But there are others who have become completely adapted to the cave. They are like bats.
Okay.
They have lived in the absolute darkness of ignorance, tribalism, and blind tradition for so many generations that their eyes have lost the ability to process illumination. For them, the light doesn't reveal truth. It literally causes them physical pain.
So if you walk into their cave and turn on a high-powered flashlight, they don't thank you.
Yeah, they don't.
They scream, they swarm you, they yell, "Turn it off, you're blinding us, you're ruining our sleep."
Yes. They have adapted so completely to the darkness that reason, objective truth, and structural reform are actively perceived as existential threats.
Wow.
When a society reaches a point where it doesn't just ignore reformers, but actively attacks the very people who are trying to turn on the lights because the light exposes the rot in their institutions, that society has crossed the tipping point.
The warning will not work on them because they have criminalized the light.
Exactly.
Okay, let's bring all these heavy, interconnected threads together and synthesize what Parwez has built here. If we zoom out and look at the entire opening of Surah Yaseen, as laid out in this lecture, we were looking at a profoundly sophisticated socio-economic diagnostic tool.
We really are. Let's summarize the architecture of this framework. First, you have the foundational governing principle, the Quran-il-Hakeem, the wise book.
The Constitution.
Right, the rational constitution of the new society, the blueprint for human flourishing. Second, you have the messenger. His function is completely redefined.
Yeah.
He is not a mystical figurehead performing parlor tricks. He is the sin, the structural, load-bearing beam whose entire purpose is supporting the weak and actively executing that constitution in the real world.
Third, you have the target audience, which radically shifts how we view the text's reach. The warning, the operating system itself, is strictly designed for those who retain the capacity to reason.
Yes.
The living, the soil that still possesses the chemical minerals necessary to grow the seed.
Exactly. And fourth, you have the tragically lost. Those who have willfully blinded themselves, strapped on the rigid neck brace of blind tradition, and allowed their own critical faculties to atrophy to the point where they are functionally unreachable by any rational warning.
They are the bats fighting the light.
They are.
So when we look at these 10 verses, sitting at the very beginning of one of the most famously recited chapters in human history, we have to realize they are not a mystical guarantee of salvation.
Right.
Mumbling them really fast over a dying relative doesn't unlock a door in the afterlife. They are a stark, highly practical map placed right at the entrance of the text.
A diagnostic map.
It's as if the text is pausing and saying, before you go any further into this blueprint, let's map out exactly which minds are actually capable of receiving this data and growing, and which ones will shatter against it.
It is the ultimate intellectual filter. And the stakes of understanding this are incredibly high.
Yeah.
This entire analysis by Parwez isn't just a fun academic exercise in reinterpreting ancient Semitic history. This is a remarkably durable framework for evaluating the modern world.
I can use this right now.
Absolutely. We can use this to evaluate the corporate teams we build, the political societies we live in, and fundamentally our own personal intellectual health.
Which is exactly where I want to leave you, the listener, today. We've talked a lot about the cognitive neck brace, about atrophy, about the arrogance of blind tradition.
Yes.
But if the ultimate test of a living mind is its proven ability to absorb a stark warning, process uncomfortable new data, and actually alter its trajectory, I want you to ask yourself a hard question.
A very hard question.
When was the last time a piece of new, deeply uncomfortable information actually caused you to fundamentally change a long-held belief?
Or have you, without even noticing the stiffness setting in, started fitting yourself for your own cognitive neck brace?
Are you the cultivated soil, ready for the friction of a new seed? Or are you, in the comfort of your own echo chamber, fighting the light simply because the dark is easier on the eyes.
It's a heavy thought.
That is the blaring alarm clock this ancient text is ringing. Let's just hope we haven't hit the snooze button so many times that we're no longer awake enough to hear it.